Robert Spencer is the director of Jihad Watch and a Shillman Fellow at the David Horowitz Freedom Center. He's the author of 18 books. I won't name them all, or half his time will be taken. A number of them are New York Times bestsellers. And I assume his new book will be, because it's already sold out on Amazon and it was just listed, and that is The History of Jihad from Muhammad to ISIS. I'd say they're available for sale on the table outside in the library, but they're already sold out. But in case you haven't had a chance to get your copy signed, I know that Robert would be happy to do so after his presentation. Other books, just quickly to name a couple, Stealth Jihad, How Radical Islam is Subverting America, The Complete Infidel's Guide to ISIS. He's led seminars on the subject of jihad and Islam for many national security government institutions, both domestic and foreign policy, the FBI, United States Central Command, U.S. Army Command and General Staff College, Justice Department, Anti-Terrorism Advisory Council, and so forth. He's a weekly columnist for PJ Media and Front Page Magazine. He's written, in addition to his 18 books, hundreds and hundreds of articles. He's a contributing writer to the Investigative Project on Terrorism and as an adjunct fellow with the Free Congress Foundation. He has an MA in Religious Studies from University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill, and he has been studying about Islamic theology, history, and law in depth since 1980. Please join me in welcoming Robert Spencer.
Thank you, Bob, and thank you, everyone, for coming. It's a great honor to me to speak at the Westminster Institute, and I admire the great work that you've done here over the years and all the resources you have provided. I hope in this book, The History of Jihad, to fill a gap that has not been addressed thus far. My friend David Wood, the great skewerer of Islamic apologists, he told me not long ago that he knew about what was in the Quran, that there were deeply problematic passages within it, and he knew about the life of Muhammad, that Muhammad was not exactly, as Karen Armstrong says, a 7th century Gandhi, but she really says that too. But he was actually a warlord who led armies, committed the assassination of his enemies, and so on. But that after that, there's a gap until 20th century jihad terrorism becomes part of our daily lives. And so the history of jihad, I wrote actually, and it's a book that I've wanted to write for many years, in order to fill that gap and to give people a general overview of what happened after Muhammad died and before the Saudis struck oil and started financing Wahhabi terrorism around the world. And it is a story that I hope you will find interesting. I think it is a pressing moment in many ways for American and American public policy and the public policy of many other countries today. And I thought that tonight I would try to outline some of that. One of the first things that I think is noteworthy about the 14th century history of jihad is what you do not see in it. And that is, you do not see any Muslim resistance to jihad activity, to jihad violence. You do not see ever in any country, at any time, in any place, under any circumstances, some large Muslim organization opposing jihad violence. Now, why does that matter? Because nowadays, Western Europe in particular, the United States to a lesser degree, we are betting our futures on the idea that we can bring in large numbers of Muslims into the United States, and we will not ever have any problem with jihad activity, that is all a thing of the past that we need not be concerned about. But one thing we also do not see in the history of jihad is any rejection, reformation, reconsideration, or other kind of mitigation of the elements of Islamic texts and teachings that gave rise to jihad activity in the first place. And so, it is certainly true, it is undeniably true that most Muslims today are not waging jihad. That's great. And once again, we are betting our future on it. However, the idea that most Muslims today are not waging jihad means that they are therefore democratic pluralists who accept the principles of human rights that are enunciated in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights of the United Nations of 1948 remains at best unproven and has no historical antecedents whatsoever. There was, all through the history of jihad, state warfare by Islamic entities against non-Muslim entities solely because they were non-Muslim. We see this right from the beginning. Muhammad, according to Islamic tradition, is supposed to have died in the year 632. And almost immediately after that, the armies came out of Arabia and conquered the Middle East and North Africa. Very soon they conquered Persia, which was one of the two great powers of the day, and they attacked the other great power of the day, the Eastern Roman or Byzantine Empire. And by 732, 100 years after the traditional date for Muhammad's death, they were, of course, in central France, fighting at Poitiers or Tours against Charles Martel, Charles the Hammer, who stopped their advance. And they besieged Constantinople, the great city of the Eastern Empire, first in 675, then again in 717, all the while thus fighting against Europe from both sides. And this book is the first to discuss this at tremendous length in a narrative fashion, they were also pressing the jihad into India and waging it with especial fury there because the Indians were not people of the book. Most of you, I'm sure, know that the Quran speaks of Jews and Christians and Zoroastrians and some others as people of the book, who have supposedly legitimate revelations from Allah that they have twisted and changed out of their original meanings, and thus they, out of respect for this revelation, they are given the opportunity to live in peace as non-Muslims within the Islamic State. But they have to submit to various humiliating and discriminatory regulations, most notably the tax, the jizya, that's specified in the Quran in chapter 9, verse 29, for the dhimmis, the so-called protected people. Now, these humiliating and discriminatory regulations made life very, very hard for these populations, such that you could ask, for example, what happened to the Christians of Egypt? Egypt was 99% Christian when it was invaded in the late 630s and conquered in the 640s. Now it's about 10% Christian. Where did all the Christians go? Did they move? No. They're still there. They're the Muslims of Egypt. And what happened was life was so difficult to live as a dhimmi in Egypt that ultimately over time, the only thing that they had to do to be out from under all this humiliation and constant harassment was to convert. They converted. It's very hard to think that anybody faced with that kind of a situation would do anything different, although, of course, some did hold out, and we should acknowledge their courage and perseverance. At the same time, the Hindus in India did not even have that protection because they were not people of the book. And consequently, the choice that Muhammad and the Quran give for the people of the book to convert or submit to the rule of Islamic law or be killed, for the Hindus it was only convert or be killed. And as I show in the book, the history of jihad in India was especially bloody and especially violent. At a certain point, actually, they had to grant them honorary people of the book status because it simply wasn't possible to kill them all. But they were still, nonetheless, extraordinarily harsh toward especially the Hindu temples. The Quran speaks about protecting churches and synagogues because the name of Allah is spoken there. That is often honored in the breach, but there was no such protection afforded to the Hindu temples at all. And thousands, tens of thousands of them were destroyed, a great patrimony of human culture lost forever. And in the middle of all this, you have, this is mainstream Islam. You have state actors doing this. First, Muhammad unifying Arabia. Then the so-called rightly guided caliphs, the four successors of Muhammad as the leaders of the Islamic community, Abu Bakr, Umar, Uthman, and Ali. And then the Umayyad Caliphate, the Abbasid Caliphate, the Ottoman Caliphate, and some of the outliers, the Umayyad Caliphate of Cordoba in Spain, the Fatimid Shiite Caliphate in Egypt. All of these are Islamic states, and they all waged jihad against non-Muslims on the basis of the Islamic imperative in the Quran and Sunnah to do so. The difference that we have nowadays comes about at the beginning of the 20th century, because the last caliphate, the Ottoman Empire, was abolished by the secular Turkish government, by Mustafa Kemal Ataturk, the founder of modern Turkey, in 1924. Now, Ataturk was nobody to admire in any respect. He was just as brutal to the religious minorities as the Ottomans had been, if not more so. But he objected to political Islam, and he was unique among the leaders of Islamic states throughout history. He was the first ever to say, the troubles that we're having come from Islam. And what we have to do is get rid of Islam as much as we can, and then our country will prosper. And he consciously patterned Turkey after Western secular models of governance. Of course, nowadays, all that's being rolled back by Recep Tayyip Erdogan, the president of Turkey today. But for almost 100 years, Turkey was a secular state, a relatively secular state, and the caliphate was no more. So what did the people who believed that there was an Islamic imperative to wage war against and subjugate unbelievers, and that the caliph was the tip of this spear, what did they do when there was no more caliph? They decided to form various international organizations that would work toward restoring the caliphate. The first of these was founded in 1928, the Muslim Brotherhood. Hassan al-Banna, the founder of the Brotherhood, made it very clear that what he was intending to do was to create a movement that would restore the caliphate and thereby the unity of the Muslims. And that once the unity of the Muslims was reestablished, then they could wage offensive jihad again against non-Muslim states. But in the meantime, there is the concept of defensive jihad. I should explain. In Sunni Islamic theology, and of course the Sunnis are 85 to 90% of Muslims worldwide, the caliph is the only one authorized to declare offensive jihad. And he's not just authorized, he has the responsibility to do so. If he doesn't do it, he could be removed on that basis. He has to declare offensive jihad on a regular basis against non-Muslim states. But if there's no caliph, there's no offensive jihad. So since 1924, all jihad has been defensive. And you might think, well, that's absurd. What was defensive about 9/11? If you read the communiques of Osama bin Laden from the 1990s, he lists a long list of grievances, terrible things that the Americans have supposedly done that justify defensive jihad against the United States. Most notably, Sunni Islamic theology specifies that if a Muslim land is attacked, it is the responsibility of every Muslim, everywhere, to wage jihad to win it back and to repel the invaders. So Osama bin Laden said, look, this is a little bit later, no, actually, it's not. I'm sorry. I'm thinking of the second Gulf War. The first Gulf War, the American troops go into Saudi Arabia, and Osama bin Laden said they're trampling down the sacred soil of the kingdom of the two holy places. They have no business being there. This is an invasion that triggers this defensive jihad. And 9/11 was a defensive jihad in that respect. Every jihad has been defensive. All 30,000 jihad attacks since 9/11 around the world. They're all couched in this. If you read the communiques of jihad leaders, they always retail grievances. It's not because they're inveterate whiners, although they are. It is also, It is also because they have to list the grievances to justify what they're doing as defensive. If they don't, then they have no authorization to wage jihad. So, what we see in that is, although there's a discontinuity at the beginning of the 20th century, and no more state actors at least directly declaring jihad and carrying it out. You could say that the Saudis, certainly with spending so many billions of dollars to spread Wahhabi Islam around the world, that is a certain waging of jihad that is just as unmistakable as any Ottoman invasion of Vienna or Eastern Europe in general. Nonetheless, the fact remains that there was a change with the demise of the caliphate in the approach to how jihad was justified. But there was no end in jihad. And above all, there was no internal resistance. First, you have mainstream Islam carrying out the jihad because you have the Islamic states of the world carrying out jihad. The Mughal Empire in India, as well as the Ottomans, the Abbasids, the Umayyads, and so on. And then you have jihadis justifying what they're doing on the basis of defensive jihad, which is a mainstream concept in mainstream Islamic law. Nowhere do you find ever in history that jihad was only the province of a tiny minority of extremists who were twisting and hijacking the true teachings of the peaceful faith. That never happens anywhere. And anybody who would challenge that, I would ask you to specify when and where was there this Islamic movement against jihad activity, under what theological basis did it proceed, and what became of it. But there just isn't any such thing in Islamic history. The second thing you do not see in the history of jihad is any let-up, any respite. It is something that people are taken by surprise about. I was speaking to a marvelous group not long ago, and they were very well informed, very committed, very interested, very involved. And I mentioned in passing this fact, that there was never any let-up, and people were shocked and said, wait a minute, what about the age of tolerance and pluralism in Al-Andalus? What about Muslim Spain? What about the paradise of tolerance and proto-multiculturalism that Maria Rosa Menoncal speaks about in her book, The Ornament of the World? Everybody knows Muslim Spain was a paradise of coexistence, right? Well, unfortunately, here again, this is a historical myth. There are a great many of these things. What I tried to do in this book, actually, was puncture some of the historical myths that people take for granted nowadays. And to do that, went back to the primary sources that were eyewitnesses, or in many cases, the Muslim court historians. The Mughals in India were especially careful to always have court historians. These guys who would, at the time something would happen, they would write about how wonderful it was that the emperor so-and-so, he just demolished 325 Hindu temples, he took all the gold and he strewed it in front of the mosque so people would trample on the idols as they went into the mosque. Isn't he wonderful? Happy Hindustan. That's a quote. It's true. Anyway, people who think that Islamic terror tactics are newly minted should look at the reality of Muslim Spain. And in particular, for example, the rule of the Cordoba Caliph Abdurrahman III. This is the words of the 11th century Muslim historian Ibn Hayyan of Cordoba. He says that on one occasion, Muhammad, an officer of Abdurrahman III, chose the 100 most important barbarians. That could be you, because there was a lot of Christians, and sent them to the Alcazar of Cordoba, where they arrived on Friday, March 2nd, 939. But since Abdurrahman was vacationing at another place, they took them there, and their marching coincided with the people coming out of the mosque on this Friday afternoon, so that many gathered and followed to see what end the prisoners would have. And it turned out Abdurrahman was installed on the upper balcony over the orchard facing the river to watch the execution. All the prisoners, one by one, were decapitated in his presence and under his eyes, in plain sight of the people. And their feelings against the infidels, Allah alleviated. You see, they were very happy to see this. As a matter of fact, the Quran, remember, in chapter 9, verse 14, says, fight them, and Allah will soothe the bosoms of the believers. And so, if you are feeling sad and depressed, kill an infidel. You'll feel better. Allah will soothe the breasts of the believers in doing this, in fighting the unbelievers. And this is something that you see actually recurring throughout Islamic history. Islamic chroniclers making reference to that and taking it quite seriously, that through these acts of savagery and violence, the Muslims were pacified and gladdened in their hearts. And of course, the most notorious example of tolerance and pluralism in Muslim Spain was in 1066 in Granada, when rules are often honored in the breach, and just because something is Islamic law doesn't mean that every Islamic ruler has always observed it. Just as every rule is not always followed by every one of us. Some of us perhaps may have had a speeding ticket now and again or something of this kind. And so in Granada in 1066, there was a Muslim ruler who had a Jewish friend whom he appointed essentially the mayor of Granada. And the local Muslims were furious because Islamic law specifies that a non-Muslim must not have authority over a Muslim, especially a Jew. And so there was a Muslim poet, and he wrote a very lengthy poem. I won't read all of it to you, but this is the tenor of it. Turn your eyes to the Jews who are outcast dogs. Why would you be different and bring them near when in all the land they are kept afar? I came to live in Granada, and I saw them frolicking there. They divided up the city and the provinces with one of their accursed men everywhere. They collect all the revenues. They dress in the finest clothes while you wear the meanest, and so on. So hasten to slaughter them as an offering. Sacrifice him, for he is a precious thing. Do not consider it a breach of faith to kill them. The breach of faith would be to let them carry on. 4,000 Jews were killed in a pogrom in Granada after this poem was published. And so this was a direct reaction to the Muslim ruler breaking Islamic law by appointing a Jew to have authority over Muslims. So this was tolerant, pluralistic Muslim Spain. What you see in the history of jihad is that wherever Muslims have gone, there have been among them violent jihadis who committed acts of violence against non-Muslims. And they were never upbraided or rebuked or otherwise opposed by any Islamic authority and were often rewarded for doing so. So we see these two things, that there was never any internal resistance and there was never any respite. These things, the violence against unbelievers is a constant of Islamic history. The third golden thread that we see in the history of jihad is that non-Muslims were often the best help to the jihadis, which ought to ring a lot of bells today. But you take, for example, the conquest of Spain. Now, the conquest of Spain is shrouded in legend, and I'm not vouching for the absolute historicity of any of this, but these legends are alive among the people of Spain to this day. And the story goes that there was a Christian count, Julian of Ceuta, who had a daughter, and his daughter was very bright. He sent her to the court, kind of like sending her to Bill Clinton's White House as an intern. And Roderick, the Visigothic king of Cordoba, was an admirable predecessor of Bill Clinton. So the girl, her degree of guilt in this is widely controverted in the Spanish legends. But in any case, Florinda is one of the most common names that has come down to her. Florinda, being thus outraged, Count Julian was even more outraged and determined that Roderick had to pay. How could he get back at the King of Spain? He decided to go to Tariq ibn Ziyad, who was a Muslim ruler in North Africa. And he told him, "You want to invade Spain?" And Tariq said, "Sure, I'd love to, but every time they see us coming in our boats, their defenses are prepared and we are repelled." So he said, "I have a solution to that. I'll give you my boats, and they'll think it's me, and no defenses will be up." And so Tariq ibn Ziyad used Count Julian's boats, got across the strait, and once on the beach, he burned Count Julian's boats, which I think is not entirely sporting. They were, after all, a loner. But he burned the boats, and he told his men, "We are going to take this land for Islam, or we're going to die here, but we're not going back." It's noteworthy in terms of how important it is to know history. A few years ago, there was a big controversy in the Minneapolis area about a charter school that was teaching Islam as fact. It was all Muslim in any case, but it was a public school getting public funds. So there was a little bit of controversy over it being a public school and being essentially a madrasa. And the name of the school, I noticed, and I was surprised to note that nobody seemed to ever ask, wait a minute, why is this school called Tariq ibn Ziyad Academy? Who's Tariq ibn Ziyad? Nobody seemed to care. Nobody ever looked it up. As far as I know, it was never in any of the Minneapolis coverage of this. But you got to wonder, why would a school in Minnesota name itself after this figure? Could it have to do with maybe having the same goals? I mean, this is what he's famous for. He's the great conqueror of Spain. And he was able to do it by means of the help of this Christian who was enraged over he had his own grievances, and I'm not saying his grievances were illegitimate, but perhaps he didn't count on the consequences that it would take 700 years to undo what he did. There are so many other examples of this in Islamic history. In 1345, the Byzantine Emperor John VI Cantacuzanos, he was in the midst of a dynastic dispute, and he invited the Ottomans to go and fight against his rivals and let them into Eastern Europe to do that. And of course, they're still there. The Ottomans, at one point, of course, controlled all of Eastern Europe. And now they just have that little bit of Europe that is so much trouble because it gives them a claim to be in NATO and everything else. The Turks, that is. But it was John, the Emperor, John VI Cantacuzanos, who allowed the Ottomans to enter Europe in the first place in order to solve his dynastic dispute. And I don't think that he expected that they were just going to stay, but he wasn't probably thinking about the whole of jihad activity or the jihad doctrine, even though it was something that he and the emperors of his time, the other emperors of his time, had ample reason to know all about. You may recall about 12 years ago now, Pope Benedict XVI got in a lot of hot water. There were riots all over the world because he quoted a Byzantine emperor, Manuel II Palaeologos. And Manuel II said, there is nothing new that Muhammad brought except what is evil and inhumane. And this, of course, was terrible and Islamophobic, and Benedict had to apologize, and innocent people were killed by those who were objected to their prophet being called evil and inhumane. And nobody here again seemed to ask, well, wait a minute, who was this Manuel II Palaeologos? Why did he say this? And he's one of the tragic figures in this book. You read about how he was essentially a vassal of the Ottoman emperor. The Ottoman emperor actually even sent him to put down uprisings among the Turks and kept him prisoner at the court, where he was routinely mocked and vilified, ridiculed. He had a very rough life, and a sad and tragic life, going also to Europe when he was free, trying to get support for a new crusade to roll the Ottomans back and preserve the Byzantine Empire, all of which failed. The Byzantine Empire fell. Constantinople was entirely conquered 9 years after his death. So he had direct daily experience of what he was talking about. And that seems to me that should have been part of the debate when the Regensburg Address controversy was raging. But here again, nobody seems to have any historical interest. One final example of non-Muslims aiding the jihad are the British, of course, who in the latter part of the 18th century, there arose a reformer in Islam. A lot of people ask me all the time, well, what are the chances of reform? What we need is Islamic reform. Another thing you'll see in this book, actually, is that there's been plenty of reform. There's lots of reform in Islamic history. Now, the thing about it is, think about reform. What is reform? Whether you're a Catholic, Protestant, Orthodox, or none of the above, the people most famously known as reformers are those who said, we're going to get rid of all the later additions and get back to the basics. That's what reformers generally do in whatever context. And so the Almohads, who were among the rulers of Muslim Spain, they were reformers. And the fellow who arose in Arabia in the 18th century to whom I referred, Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab, he was a reformer. He began to fight against the Ottomans. He said they were not Islamic enough. They had strayed from true Islam. He was going to restore true Islam. He began to gain a following when he personally stoned an adulteress to death to show how Islamic he was. And he did get a following. One of the main followers he got early on was a chieftain in Arabia named Ibn Saud. Ibn Saud and Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab began to fight a jihad against the Ottomans, against the other rulers in Arabia. They began to gain a little bit of territory. And by the middle of the 19th century, the Wahhabi movement, the Saudi movement, caught the attention of the British Empire, which was in several hundred years of struggle against the Ottomans. Now, the Ottomans by this time had well earned the nickname the sick man of Europe. And they weren't really a formidable force at all. But the British wanted to administer the coup de grace, and they thought, this guy Saud, these Saudis, they could help us. So they started bankrolling them. They started giving them money. And at the end of World War I, they favored the Saudis over the Hashemites and others to gain control of Arabia and help to establish the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. Of course, the rest is history. The Saudis struck oil, and what did they use our oil money to do but spread Wahhabi Islam around the world? This reformist idea of Islam that is even more virulent and violent than other forms. So we have the British to thank for that, as for so much else. They are probably, I would say, the most responsible outside of the Saudis themselves for the spread of Wahhabi Islam around the world. When the Wahhabis did begin to spread their version of Islam around the world, there were many areas where jihad was essentially quiescent. This doesn't mean it was reformed or rejected. It was just ignored. As a matter of fact, one of the pamphlets that the Saudis distributed was called Jihad, the Forgotten Obligation. And they wanted to bring it all back, and they did. So we can thank King George, or whoever it was at that time, for this marvelous calculation. But of course, in all of these and so many other examples I could give you, and perhaps the most stinging is George W. Bush, when 6 days after 9/11, I wrote this book more or less chronologically. I don't usually do that, but this was a book of, as I said at the beginning, I've wanted to write this book for many years. I've had all this material and just haven't had the opportunity to put it all together. Finally, I got the opportunity last winter to put it all together, and I did, and I just started at the beginning and went all the way through, essentially, most of the time. And so what happened was, I got to 9/11 after I'd written 14 centuries of jihad activity. And I got to 6 days after 9/11 with all of this very much in my mind, just having set it down on paper. And there's George W. Bush in the mosque in front of Nihad Awad of CARE, which is tied to Hamas and the Muslim Brotherhood, and Abdurrahman al-Amoudi of the American Muslim Council, who is now doing 23 years in prison. Well, his sentence was reduced by Obama, but he was sentenced to 23 years for financing al-Qaeda. And he stands in front of them in the mosque in Washington and says Islam is a religion of peace. It really hit me. After reading this uninterrupted, unmitigated, no let-up jihad for 14 centuries, this guy says Islam is a religion of peace. Now, we know he had various political reasons for doing so, things that he thought would make things easier for our allies or whatever. We don't have to go over all that, at least not right now, maybe in the question period if you like. But George W. Bush was, in a short-sighted manner, actually enabling jihad activity by foreclosing upon an examination of the motivating ideology that gives fuel to it. And he was doing so on the basis of short-sighted political calculations, just as much as Count Julian was when he invited Tariq ibn Ziyad into Spain, and just as much as the British were when they funded the Wahhabis, and John VI Cantacuzene was when he invited the Ottomans to fight his rival. It never ends up working out for the infidels, because the infidels have their own immediate goals, but the jihadis always have the goal of establishing Islamic law over the world, and will take and have taken throughout history any advantage in which to do that. So the history of jihad, I think, is one that it is extraordinarily important for people, especially in the government, in the military, to be aware of. You cannot solve the problem unless you know exactly the dimensions of the problem itself, and that is where we have so signally failed since 9/11, especially with the advent of Obama and his forbidding of any mention of Islam and jihad in counterterror training in 2011. So it is imperative that we reacquaint ourselves with this history, that we ponder very carefully its implications for our stances toward various policy questions today. I mean, one of the most obvious, of course, is immigration, the Trump travel bans. Is it really wise to bring in large Muslim populations into the country? Obviously, not every Muslim we bring in is going to be a jihadi, but among them there will be, or at least people who think that Sharia ought to be the law of the land. How is that going to work out in terms of a tolerant and pluralistic society when you introduce this radically intolerant force? Another one is, of course, our alliances with Pakistan, with Turkey, where it's very clear that these entities are now on the other side, if they ever were not on the other side. And is it really prudent to keep pouring money into these countries when we've known for 10 years, for example, in regard to Pakistan, that they've been turning around and taking a great deal of it and giving it to the people they're supposed to be using it to fight? So not only do we need a reconfiguration of our international alliances, but a general reevaluation of our stance, also, of course, ultimately towards states like Saudi Arabia. It's very clear, of course, that the president is playing a very delicate game, a dangerous game, but one that probably has to be played in working with the Saudis against Iran. At the same time, we have to recognize that the Saudis ultimately are only going to be our friends to a certain degree. And that after that, there is the jihad imperative that overrides any possibility of any long-standing or deeply fruitful cooperation. But none of this can happen unless we recognize the problem to start with. It was because of this that I wrote this book. I hope that it will spark discussion on these issues in places where it can make a difference. And I thank you all for coming out to consider these things with me. If you have any questions, comments, death fatwas, whatever, I'm all ears. Thank you very much.
Please, when you speak directly into the microphone and wait until Jessica brings the microphone to you before you ask the question, so that your question may be immortalized. By the way, I wanted to also welcome a late arrival, Bud McFarland, Security Advisor to President Reagan.
The immortal Dr. Hull.
Robert, you're a good friend and a great American. Thank you for this incredible book, which is something that I think I have thought I needed in my own scholarship, so I'm really glad that you wrote it. First, what I wanted to ask you was with respect to President Trump, what you would specifically recommend, given the beginning of the administration ended, given the beginning of his campaign when he talked so much about radical Islamic terrorism, and then the dramatic decline in his mentions of radical Islamic terrorism as the administration was filled with people who disagreed with him on that, and as he went to Saudi Arabia and began to cut deals. What would you recommend to him in terms of actually winning this war? How can we translate the understanding of jihad into victory for the United States and for the Peace of Westphalia, for, as my colleague Lopez has said, for the free world
Thank you. That's a great question. He doesn't really have to say anything as far as I'm concerned. It's much more important what he does. And I just mentioned in passing that Obama mandated that all mention of Islam and jihad be scrubbed from counterterror training. This is unbelievable. People have trouble believing this, but it's absolutely true. You can go online and look at the Countering Violent Extremism program. There is no mention, there's no hint in it that there's any problem with Islamic jihad. It doesn't exist. It's actually an elaborate exercise in pretending that it doesn't exist. That's what he should address. What I've been so signally disappointed by, and I hesitate to say this because he's done so remarkably well and surprisingly well in so many ways. Moving the embassy to Jerusalem, standing up to the violent intimidation that has hamstrung American foreign policy for so many years in that, and so many other things. But I've been sort of surprised and disappointed that he has not addressed this. He needs to open up, mandate, perhaps by an executive order or whatever engine would do it effectively, mandate that the FBI, that DHS, that the CIA, the Pentagon, all of them, that they not only are allowed to study Islam, but that they must. And that it must not be from these smooth apologists from the Council on American Islamic Relations and so on that have demonstrable ties to our enemies. But it has to be from people who are going to speak about it honestly and realistically. Now, he's going to catch hell for that because, of course, all the people who speak about it honestly and realistically are hate group leaders according to the Southern Poverty Law Center. And so that has to be directly opposed and rebuked, and an unapologetic setting out of the necessity, going back to Sun Tzu, that you have to know your enemy. We have to understand this. And he could even say, you know, I wouldn't have any objection at all if he were to say that this might be a completely wrong understanding of Islam. I grant you, this could be twisted, hijacked, false Islam, and real Islam is as cuddly as it could possibly be. But we have to understand the motivating ideology of the enemy, and this is what it is. And so we're going to study it in depth instead of pretending it doesn't exist. And the Muslim Brotherhood elements, of course, in the U.S. government, that has to be also addressed as well. That people like Hisham Islam, who made sure that Major Stephen, Hisham Islam was the, I believe, Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense? Advisor to Gordon England, who was the Assistant Secretary of Defense in George W. Bush's administration. That he obviously, he had ties to the Brotherhood and so on. And so why was he wielding this influence? He's the one who got Major Coughlin fired when Major Stephen Coughlin, who I'm sure many of you know, was the Pentagon's only expert on Islamic law. And so this is an issue that he needs to be made aware of, but I don't know that there's anybody around him who is telling him about it. I think we have to wait for the microphone. So, sorry. Thank you. Yes, that's right. Yes. Yeah.
Meanwhile, extreme Islamists are admitted to the UK and given government funds there. So the question is, and also here in the universities in America, I saw a video with you, I think it was Berkeley, where some other university administrators were involved in
Stanford. Yes.
Close.
I'm supposed to go to Berkeley in a couple weeks. I'm really looking forward to that.
I mean, I'm sure you probably have never been invited, hardly ever invited to university to give a talk, an official talk there, or rare.
No, when I get invited to speak at universities, it's by the College Republicans or Young America's Foundation, a group like that. And I've never been invited by the university administrators, ever. And when I am invited to a university, it's as if Jack the Ripper has been invited. And there is an uproar like you wouldn't believe. And it's very clear that what we see is the fruit of indoctrination, that these children have been told that Islamophobia is a big problem. And Islamic Jihad terror is really something that's just a manifestation of a reaction to American imperialism and the state of Israel. And this is one of the reasons why I wrote the book. I know that probably most college students will never hear about it.
Will libraries buy it?
Some of them will, yeah, absolutely. But I don't have any control over how much it's distributed or who reads it. But this is one of the reasons why I wrote it, as a contribution to try to correct this. You're absolutely right that. Thank you. Really, up until about 1970, everybody knew that I wasn't saying it then, I was 8, but everybody knew that what I'm saying is true. Everybody knew that Islam was not a religion of peace. Winston Churchill says this, John Quincy Adams, Thomas Jefferson and John Adams, despite the myth-making about Thomas Jefferson nowadays. Everybody took these things for granted. It was obvious. But there has been a concerted effort at disinformation and rewriting of history that has been remarkably effective, and that we need to be energetically counteracting. Thank you. Well, no, I didn't, but it's a good title. Terrific title. I wish I had. In any case, what do we do? That's right, Trevor Loudon. What do we do about this? Of course, we have to be true to our own principles, and that means that something like mass deportation or something of this kind, this is not even on the table, of course, nowadays. What we need to do are some things that I think would be very simple and effective and ought to be common sense measures that would go a long way to solving this problem. One is enforce our own laws and be consistent in that enforcement. There should be one law. It was actually the great achievement of Western civilization that there's one law for everybody. That this is the Magna Carta, people. You know that there's not one law for the noblemen and the other law for the commoners. It's one law for everyone. Everyone is responsible in the same way. And so if we were to enforce that, then polygamists, for example, would be arrested. Those who practice female genital mutilation, those who violate any number of other American laws that are already at variance with Sharia principles. If we were to make it clear that those laws would be enforced, then the followers of Sharia would have the choice to either renounce those aspects of Islam in a genuine and sincere way, or leave the country. But they're not going to be able to have both. Also, of course, you have laws against subversion and sedition, which would mean that even this preaching that Sharia ought to be the law of the land eventually would be something that would be legally actionable. These things are already laws that are on the books. It's just that they're not being applied. Ibrahim Hooper of CARE, there was a house fire a few years back in the Bronx, and this guy was killed, and his wives. And so the New York Times rather blandly noted, he had 3 or 4 wives, he was a Muslim, and Ibrahim Hooper was trotted out from the Council on American Islamic Relations to say, yeah, there are, I believe he said 50,000 Muslims and polygamous arrangements in the United States. And then the New York Times moved on, of course, to something else, probably Islamophobia backlash. But wait a minute, that's illegal in the United States. The Latter-day Saints Church had to change its doctrine to get Utah admitted as a state. And so why are we tolerating this now? And these questions remain unanswered. Why indeed? Why has there been no prosecution? Why are there only 2 doctors now? That it's only been since Trump took office that anybody was ever prosecuted for female genital mutilation. These 2 doctors who are still on trial in Detroit. You can't tell me they're the first ones that ever did it in the United States. There are thousands of people who have suffered this in the United States, and nothing's been done. So my first recommendation is enforce our own laws.
Thank you very much.
Thank
for
you.
the brilliant presentation. Besides Count Julian,
Yes,
there were other traitors,
lots of them.
including Catholic Archbishop.
Yeah, what's his name? Opas?
Uh,
I have him in the book. Yeah?
Yes, I think that's the name.
Yeah, he's the guy who told Pelayo. I don't mean to, if you were going to tell the story, go ahead.
No.
Pelayo was the last holdout. I hope you will all be Pelayos if it comes to this. When all of Spain was conquered, there was this one guy, and he wasn't going to play. And he went up on top of a mountain with a small band of followers, and the Muslims tried to get at him, but he was up a mountain. And so he was able to rain down stones upon the jihadis and keep them from coming up. And eventually they said, what do we care about this band of barbarians perched on a rock? They'll die off. But Opas was a bishop, a Spanish bishop in the tradition of Pope Francis. And he went to Pelayo and he said, I believe that you now understand how the entire army of the Goths cannot resist the force of the Muslims. How then can you resist on this mountain? Listen to my advice. Abandon your efforts, and you will enjoy many benefits alongside the Muslims. Pope Francis is, he had to have, he's the worthy successor of Opas, the bishop in Spain.
The question is, isn't it true that we will face such traitors here in the West?
Oh, yeah.
In Europe, etc. When push comes to shove, we will have these problems.
Yeah, there's no doubt about it. Obviously, I am classifying Pope Francis as chief among them, that in shaming the Christians of Europe and telling them that they're not good Christians unless they accept the Muslim migrants, and saying that there should be no walls. Well, tear down your Vatican walls, pal. But the Vatican walls were put up in the year 846 after the Muslims sacked Rome. They couldn't actually get in because of the existing walls, and the ones that are there are reinforcements of those because they made some breaches and they sacked St. Peter's, which was outside the walls at the time, and St. Paul outside the walls. So he should think back on the example of his predecessors, but no, he's the woke pope, and he's not going to do that. Yes, ma'am.
Hi, thank you for presenting us on this relay. I have a couple comments regarding the unequivocal laws. So my daughters have always gone to Christian and Catholic schools, and we've had a chance to play all of the Islamic academies. The guarded one with guns that you have to enter off of 123, the one in Alexandria, and the new King Abdullah Golden Lane School.
You play in sports?
We play basketball there.
Oh, my.
And soccer. And,
Their team is the bomb.
so
Yeah.
in practice games, if you go to the restrooms, they only bring out bar soap in the bathrooms for when visitors come. And if let's just say I've been a teacher and worked in public and private schools, if we didn't have soap, we would have been closed down. Second, I don't really understand how these schools can get along with segregated classrooms and how that's allowed in America.
Well, see, these things are all allowed in America now because we're not enforcing the laws. The ACLU fought for decades to get Christian prayer out of the schools, right? And now in Texas, there's a public school that has an Islamic prayer room. And the Attorney General of the state of Texas wrote to them and said, we have this thing, separation of church and state. You got to close down the Islamic prayer room. And they refused. So what's he going to do? Call out the National Guard? He didn't do anything. They still have their prayer room. And he ought to get police and go in there and say this is illegal. But instead, it's happening all over the country. I was debating a couple of imams a few years back in University of Michigan at Ann Arbor. And I went into the men's room. It's a public university. There's a foot bath for the Islamic prayers. And I looked around. There were no holy water fonts. It was very strange. It seems as if there's only accommodation at public expense of one religion only. But
My nephew is studying international relations with the Middle Eastern minor, and he's in the Navy ROT scholarship, and this is at GW University. And he and I have significant debates, and I really don't understand how a university such as GW can not be teaching true Islam to those young people who are minoring or majoring in Middle Eastern studies.
I'll tell you something. I doubt there's a single university in the country that speaks honestly about these issues. I was at Cal Poly. I was speaking at Cal Poly University in San Luis Obispo, California. Very pretty place. And I was speaking about this, how universities today, they're one-party states. And there's only one point of view allowed. And that's the far left point of view and the corollary idea that Islam is a religion of peace that has, as Hillary Clinton said, nothing whatsoever to do with terrorism. And so I was at Cal Poly and I was challenging them about this. And I said, for example, I'll bet that the point of view that I represent, that there are texts of the Quran and teachings of Muhammad and rulings of Islamic law that justify violence against unbelievers and have been acted upon by Muslims throughout history, that is nowhere ever discussed in any of your classes that touch on Islam. And this one girl said, oh no, we talked about your book just last week. And I said, oh really? And what did you say? And she said that hate speech is not free speech. And see, what they taught them was that I was purveying hate speech, which ought not to have First Amendment protection. It ought to be forcibly suppressed by government agencies. And this is very, very common in American universities today. And I think that, well, of course, the corruption of the academy started in earnest in the 1960s with the long march through the institutions that the hard left began at that time. And it becomes a self-perpetuating thing. One leftist professor gets in, and then he recommends his friend, and then a little while later, they're the hiring board, and they only hire their own people. And now it's all completely closed off to any truth about these issues. Of course, then also there's the Saudi money. Georgetown University has the Prince Al-Walid bin Talal Center for Muslim Christian Understanding. They got, I believe it was $12 million from Al-Walid, who's a Saudi prince, to 20. I thought it was 20, half to Harvard and half to Georgetown. No, 20 to Georgetown. Great. And so if you look at the Al-Walid Center and the Bridge Initiative that comes from it, it's all dedicated to fighting Islamophobia and got dossiers on all the people who are so evil who talk about how they get the crazy idea that Islam is not peaceful. And they do bamboozle a lot of people in this way. Of course, Georgetown is the worst, but there are many, many other universities that have taken the Saudi money. Yes, sir. Oh, sorry, the microphone. Yes, I forgot about. Hey, I think I know you back in the dark. How are you? Likewise.
Speaking of trainers, can you comment on how Colin Burnett and Linda Sarsour are leading Jihad in 2018 America?
Sure. Linda Sarsour, of course, is one of the most interesting and paradoxical figures of our time. I know she's really irritating, but just a minute, if you ponder with me, a feminist icon who wears a hijab, the leader of the Women's March on Washington the day after Trump is inaugurated, and she's wearing this and says, that's my choice. And meanwhile, there are untold numbers. We'll never know the number of women who've been brutalized and killed for not wearing the hijab. We know that Aqsa Parvez in Mississauga, Ontario in 2007 was strangled to death by her father and her brother with the hijab she would not wear. We know, I have a long list that I keep current at Jihad Watch whenever I come across a story, and now it's this long, of women who have been threatened, who've been killed, who have been brutalized for not wearing the hijab. The very idea of the hijab is inherently misogynistic. Do you know why women have to wear the hijab? Yes, they have to. It's a woman's responsibility to make sure a man is not tempted. And so apparently the temptation in here is in the hair. So the hair has to be covered. The harmful hair rays have to be extinguished. And if the man is still tempted, if the woman is raped or attacked, it's her fault. She did not succeed in extinguishing the temptation. And that is why we have the niqab and the burqa. Because if the hijab doesn't do it, then cover the face. If the covering the face doesn't do it, cover the eyes. And what you have then is an inherently misogynistic garment that is a symbol, very neatly and clearly, of the oppression of women and the second-class status of women in Islamic law. So you have this woman who's wearing it very proudly and lying about it. She's openly pro-Sharia. She's got familial ties to Hamas. She has said that she wants to mutilate the women who are opposing jihad. She named Brigitte Gabriel and Ayaan Hirsi Ali. And this is somebody who's celebrated as a great hero. She was just arrested a couple days ago at the hearing for... She wanted to get arrested. It was a stunt that she was showing again how terrible this Kavanaugh is and how it's part of the breakdown of the civility in the American society and the extreme polarization. But what she is trying to do actually is normalize, tell them I'm not here, is normalize the idea that, just snub them. I wouldn't answer either. Anyway, normalize the idea that hijab is completely ordinary, is something that we're going to have to get used to seeing, that it is something that represents the marvelous diversity of American culture. And you notice that this diversity is in favor of this radically oppressive and intolerant belief system. You also have, you asked about Kaepernick. How do you say his name? I don't know. I don't follow football, but I know, I looked it up the other day, that the 49ers, when he was quarterback in 2016, were 1-10. And it's interesting to note that the great football fan Mahmoud Ahmadinejad tweeted the other day that this is the best quarterback in the league, and he doesn't have a contract. Obviously, the Iranians want to exploit the divisions in American society, and so they take this anti-American figure and exalt him. And of course, everything is so confused and polarized in America today. You even have Nike exalting him. And it's good to see that Nike lost $3.5 billion today. So there are still some people who object. But these are directly anti-American initiatives. The exaltation of these people is directly anti-American and in service. I think Ahmadinejad's tweet about Kaepernick, it shows vividly that what this is about is in service of the jihad, to weaken American society so that ultimately it collapses and can be replaced by a Sharia state. That may be fanciful, but the efforts to destroy American society in service of that fanciful goal is not fanciful at all. Yes?
First of all, thank you for a superb presentation.
Thank you.
Two very quick questions. One, you mentioned in the 1960s when we began to see the change in academic study or
Yes.
exposition of Islam. Who were some of the leading purveyors of alternate history, for lack of a better phrase? And I'll leave it at that. I have another question if I have time later on.
Okay, sure. The primary person that you can credit, although his influence it has to come from other sources. The fact that he became so wildly influential. But the primary person responsible for the obfuscation in Middle East studies, for the extinguishing of true teaching about Islam, and the introduction of all these politically correct falsehoods is Edward Said. Edward Said, of course, was a Christian Arab who was the author of a book called Orientalism, in which he explained that it was essentially a colonialist enterprise to criticize Islam. That if you were criticizing Islam, It was only in service of destroying the Islamic world such that it could be colonized by the West. And that, therefore, all criticism of Islam essentially had to be rejected by anybody who was against imperialism.
So it sounds like it was more ideological than theological on his part.
Yeah, it wasn't theological at all on his part. I mean, you can't really sustain the idea that Islam is a religion of peace in any honest manner. I tell you something, sometimes, I mean, I get people telling me I'm an idiot all the time, and maybe they're right, but Tahir al-Qadri is a Pakistani theologian who wrote a 512-page fatwa proving that Islam is a religion of peace. And I get people, even now, especially when it came out, I would get people writing me every couple days saying, why don't you read Tahir al-Qadri? And then you will see that you are Islamophobe. And so I read it. And it was very helpful that it was available in a PDF, excuse me, that was searchable. So I searched. I searched for 2-191, which is kill them wherever you find them. I searched for 489, which is kill them wherever you find them. I searched for 9.5, which is kill the idolaters wherever you find them. I searched for 929, which is fight against those who don't believe in Allah on the last day and do not forbid what he has forbidden, even if they are of the people of the book, until they pay the jizya with willing submission and feel themselves subdued. I searched for 47.4, when you meet the unbelievers, strike the necks. I searched for 860, strike terror in the hearts of the enemies of Allah. I searched for 151, soon we will strike terror, we meaning Allah, in the hearts of the unbelievers. And on and on and on. Not one of them was mentioned. So 512 pages of blather where he never even addressed the passages of the Quran that jihadis use to justify violence and make recruits among peaceful Muslims. That's how they convince people that Islam is a religion of peace. And so some non-Muslim reads Tahir al-Qadri and thinks, oh, well, this is a respected Islamic theologian who's showing that Islam is a religion of peace. He doesn't know what's in the Quran. He doesn't know those verses to search for. They fall for it. And there are many, many examples of expositions of that kind. You don't find, you can't find, because Islam is not a religion of peace, any honest appraisal of how the Quran's violent verses don't really have any force in the modern age. You will find people saying, oh, that only applies to the 7th century, which in the first place contradicts the idea that the Quran is the perfect book that's the perfect guide for human behavior for all time. And then we hear, oh yeah, but large portions of it only apply to 1400 years ago. It doesn't make any sense. But secondly, if you say that the Quran's passages only apply to a very strictly circumscribed period of time, then you've got to deal with the fact that all throughout history, Muslims misunderstood that and behaved violently on the basis of these passages. And so you've got the most spectacular failure to communicate the truths of the religion that has ever been in the history of the world, in any religion. And so it just doesn't make any sense, either way. I don't know. Yes, yes, sir.
Thank you very much for speaking the truth.
Thank you.
And your mention of John Brennan caught my attention because I'm a former intelligence officer, and I suspect he's the only director of CIA who ever voted for the Communist Party candidate in the election. He wasn't the only one who opposed the no discussion of Islam on the intelligence committee. But that aside, well, I might add, that was indeed the FBI as well.
Yes.
Would you care to give us your assessment of the role of the intelligence community in the dumbing down of our appreciation of the threat of Islam?
Well, the intelligence community has done a grave disservice to our understanding of the threat by partnering with people who represent aspects of the threat. I mean, you have the extraordinarily strange situation of the Justice Department determining that CAIR, the Council on American Islamic Relations, and ISNA, the Islamic Society of North America, are tied to Hamas and the Muslim Brotherhood. And then you have the FBI having them to lunch and consulting with them. And the amount of interaction is actually extraordinary. People don't know. Pamela Geller and I did a Freedom of Information Act years ago, way back in 2011 or 12. We did a FOIA request on the interaction of the FBI with CARE and ISNA. And we got a stack of documents this high that they said, this is the first volume. We'll get you the rest later. They never did. But in that, there was nothing much that was explosive, and there was a great deal that was redacted. But what came through was the friendly daily interaction. And Eric Treen in the Department of Homeland Security and others writing to these, emailing these CARE and ISNA operatives and saying, lunch is on us today, and what are you guys having? And they're bringing them in to consult on a regular basis. And this is like if FDR had the German-American Bund, Fritz Kuhn, come into the White House and chat after the United States declared war on Germany. Yes, well, you've got a point there. There are precedents. Yes, hi. How are you?
To have a micro example of what you've just been talking about, we now have, as the charge d'affaires for the Sudan embassy, the former head of national intelligence and secret services in Sudan, Mohammed Atta El-Mullah, is here. We're trying to normalize relations with Sudan. We're on step 2, according to the Atlantic Council. What do you make of that?
It's just more of the same short-sighted realpolitik that we think that we can deal with these people on the basis that we deal with France or Germany. That it really comes from the postmodern notion that everybody's good at heart, and if we just sit down and talk about our differences, we'll be able to find common ground. And that really, of course, guides so much of Western policy. That the Ayatollah Khamenei and Hassan Rouhani, they're just guys like us. And we can strike a deal. We just have to come to an understanding. The idea that there might be people who have radically different values, radically different priorities, no interest really in being pals, it doesn't enter their minds. But this is a deeply entrenched State Department idea that goes back to the hearts and minds initiatives that we pursued in the Third World in the Cold War. And it's just been transposed now to a new context where it's even less effective because there's no way, with a certain kind of Islamic mindset. Now, people are people everywhere, and human nature is always the same. You might be able to win over some hearts and minds somewhere. But generally, you've got also to deal with Muslim clerics who will tell you that the infidels will come and try to steal your Islam away by giving you roads and hospitals and basketballs and such. And you have to hate them all the more when they come to you with all their largesse. But take it. And so it's ultimately just a waste of time and a waste of money, and it's not going to get us anywhere. And I can guarantee you that. And if I talked to those guys today, they would say, well, you don't know anything. You've never been a diplomat. You've never been in the Foreign Service. You have to leave this to the experts. But the fact is, what they have done and the basis on which they have done it has failed again and again and again and again and again. And I am advocating here for some very simple and obvious truths that if they were to base their actions upon rather than their wishful thinking and fantasy-based policy making that they're pursuing today, they might end up being more successful. And I would submit that when we look back on this, when our children's children look back on this after they've paid the jizya, they will see that this whole establishment, foreign policy establishment, was wrong-headed. And I hope that we wake up to that before it's too late.
If I remember correctly, there were papers found in a basement in Edinburgh during the Homeland trial, which outlined all the steps that the government would take in order to bring Sharia to overcome our government. Anyway, I think that 3% of the population was the number that I focused on. If I remember
Yes.
Well, I read in the paper today, 2 days ago, that 93 Muslims are running for office in our country now. And nobody seems to think, oh, what's going on? And how does that relate to? They don't read, they don't think, they don't know anything.
Yeah. So consider Keith Ellison. I don't really know the story about why he's leaving Congress. It would seem to me that being a member of the House of Representatives is better than being Attorney General of the state of Minnesota. My immediate guess as to why he's moving down is because perhaps of the allegations against him. I don't know. But think about what damage he can do as Attorney General of the state of Minnesota, which has been a hotbed of jihad activity. And Al-Shabaab recruitment, ISIS recruitment right in Minneapolis among the Somali community. If he puts an end to investigations of that, it can proliferate. And he could be in a position to do that very easily.
And what would you suggest as a way to capture all these people that are running?
We have to be able to speak forthrightly about these issues. But right now, that's why they've been so indefatigable in making sure that speaking forthrightly about these issues has been so terribly stigmatized. And anybody who speaks out about this or raises concerns or says, wait a minute, do we really want a hijab-wearing Muslim in the United States Congress? What are the implications of that? And then, of course, you have to deal with the charges of racism and bigotry and Islamophobia. Well, if you are willing to brave that, then you can speak about the nature of Sharia and of women's rights and the implications of wearing a hijab, such as I outlined a little while ago with Sarsour, and try to frame Ilhan Omar, the hijab-wearing congressional candidate. Of course, she's running unopposed, so it would just be a matter of trying to call attention to these issues. She's going to Congress. But show her to be what she really is, as an instrument of oppression and somebody who is trying to make the world worse for women. And we have to go on the offensive in this regard. The problem is then all these problems become interrelated, and then the problem of our being deplatformed and not being able to have a voice in social media becomes a very salient issue. So we can only hope that some of this is going to break our way. But the deplatforming is very serious, because if we can have the best arguments in the world, but if we can't get them out, then we're done for. And the social media giants today control the means of communication to a greater degree than any totalitarian state ever did.
Grover Norquist was mentioned in the news a few years ago. I haven't heard about him. Do you have any inside baseball about that?
I don't actually. I haven't heard anything. Maybe Claire knows or Chris, but I haven't heard anything about what Grover Norquist has been doing. Many of you know, I'm sure, that he was involved with Abdurrahman al-Amoudi, the al-Qaeda financier. He had connections to other people who were very questionable in regard to their own connections to Hamas and the Muslim Brotherhood and so on. And he's always been very, very dismissive to anybody, notably Frank Gaffney, who has called attention to this and just accused them of racism and Islamophobia, and that's the end of the story. And this kind of thing is, I think, emblematic of the fix that we're in, that these kinds of discussions that we need to have. If Grover really is compromised with all his power and influence, then that's a very important question. But we can't even ask it. Just like when Michelle Bachmann asked about asked for an investigation of Muslim Brotherhood infiltration into the United States government, St. John McCain denounced her on the floor of the Senate and shut it down. Yes, I do think that.
Is there orchestration of this strategy? Are Sunnis and Shias cooperating, or how might this be working?
Sunnis and Shias are certainly cooperating. I don't know where the ultimate orchestration comes from, but there is orchestration. I could tell you that because I'm constantly trying to answer their arguments on an intellectual basis at Jihad Watch, my website, and various articles and such. And I notice that there are certain times when many, many Muslim spokesmen say the same thing. You know, Ibrahim Hooper will make a statement the Muslims are the new Jews. And then 3 days later, Reza Aslan will say, the Muslims are the new Jews. And a couple days after that, Keith Ellison will say, the Muslims are the new Jews. And I think, okay, who told them to say the Muslims are the new Jews? And I don't know who's coordinating it, but there is coordination. It seems to me to be clear. And yes, the Sunnis and Shia are cooperating. Of course, the most obvious example of that is 9/11, when the Saudis and Iran collaborated in working with the 9/11 hijackers. There's documentation of this, much of it thanks to Claire Lopez, in the book, The History of Jihad. And, of course, the Iranians, the Islamic Republic of Iran, which is Shiite, today funds Sunni Hamas and Islamic Jihad, as well as having also funded Al-Qaeda and the Taliban, which are Sunni. There's an old proverb, my brother against my brother, but both of us against our cousin. And Sunnis and Shia hate each other, but they'll always collaborate against infidels.
I'm afraid we're out of time.
Thank you. It's been a
Thank
pleasure.
you.